आपका आज वीडियो में। तो आज वीडियो हम लेकर आए, उसका टाइटल है
Why so many people get India wrong, American POV यानी कि पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू।
तो चलिए देखते हैं वीडियो से पहले
इस वीडियो चैनल का वीडियो लिंक आपको हमारी वीडियो के डिस्क्रिप्शन मिल जाएगा। सब्सक्राइब किए, लाइक किए, शेयर को फॉलो करेंगे चैनल को। उसके अलावा मैं चैनल का लिंक भी हमारी वीडियो के डिस्क्रिप्शन मिल जाएगा। सब्सक्राइब किए, लाइक किए, शेयर को फॉलो करें।
चलिए देख लेते हैं ये वीडियो।
Some of the comments I've read, I've been to India, it's the dirtiest place I've ever been, and I never go back. Are you kidding? Like, I mean, most Indians keep their homes immaculately and beautifully.
Meet Jeff Goldberg, an American film director who's been living in India for almost 15 years, where he runs his own acting studio. Jeff shares common prejudices about India in America, how to understand India if you're not from there, and whether the caste system affects foreigners who live in India. I'm Chernov, your insider to Expat Life. Chalo!
So especially for Americans, especially Americans my age or my generation, easily the worst thing to ever happen was Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. You know, because that film is so incredibly prejudiced and just straight up, to use modern nomenclature, unwoke. You know, I've always wanted to say to Steven Spielberg, so Steven, if you're listening, I want to ask you a question, which is, why would you take easily one of the greatest cuisines in the world, Indian food, and make a mockery of it in that scene when they're eating dinner at the Maharaja's palace? I've never understood that, because it's like there are so many things that India is known for, but certainly one of them that it's globally recognized for is how absolutely delicious and stunningly good and diverse Indian food is. And suddenly to have this Maharaja scene, which is totally like just stereotyped and upside down, is really, really, really strange. And even people say, oh, you know, but Jeff, they're in the Temple of Doom Palace, so of course they'd eat the snake surprise and eyeball soup. But it's like, wait, even in the village, you have them eating like bugs in the food and stuff. And I can tell you one thing, and I mean this with all the respect it deserves, is no matter where you eat in India, you will eat clean, good food. People take that very, very seriously. Even people at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, you know, you eat really nice stuff. It might be simple, but it will definitely be yummy. So I've always wondered why he did that. Anyway, yeah, so sometimes you have to debunk rumors and ideas like that. Americans are it's a very insular country, as much as it doesn't think it is, as much as it thinks it's a global player, and it is a global player on the world stage in terms of its foreign affairs and, of course, its military. But the average American isn't the most worldly person, for better or worse, and that's not a criticism, it's just seems to be a fact. And when they come outside of that bubble, the expectations that they come with are often things they learned on television or in the media that probably are either A, old news, antiquated, or maybe just straight up wrong. You have to sort of debunk some of that stuff along the way, you know. Like, for instance, some of the comments I've read in yours and my chats is, you know, I've been to India, it's the dirtiest place I've ever been, and I never go back. You know, look, I mean, I can't sit here and say that India doesn't have some sanitary issues, but at the same time, like, are you kidding? Like, I mean, most Indians keep their homes immaculately and beautifully, and the vast majority of people have folks come in and clean each day for them. So to sit there and say it's a dirty place is a false narrative, and when you label it like that and you make that general sort of statement, you diminish a truth, and that's unfortunate. And then you propagate that truth and you allow that truth to become fact, and unfortunately, that might actually dissuade people from wanting to come here and see what it's like, and I would never, ever, ever do that. I think that's a terrible thing to do to any country or culture. Well, I think you got to get on the ground and see it for yourself and make your own judgments.
Why do you think there are so many like misconceptions that I personally see, like in the media, in YouTube comments, some different type of stereotypes about India, like spreading around?
I'll be honest. There's a wonderful book by a French doctor from the 1950s, 40s, 50s, and 60s named Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was a doctor born in the French West Indies in Martinique, and he wrote a book about his experiences when he moved to the metropolitan part of France, which is European France, and then his experiences as a medical doctor and psychiatrist during the Algerian War in northern Africa. And the book, The Wretched of the Earth, is about the colonial mindset and the experience of the colonized through a psychological lens, and speaking about how they feel, the violence, the degradation, the racism, the bigotry they dealt with, and how that has manifested itself in the Algerian context into the FLN, which was fighting the French to get them out of Algeria, and the violence that incurred. It's a wonderful book, and I think it's a very important book for people to read today, because when you look around at the situation in the world, you can still find a lot of truisms or paradigms that would be important to recognize. That said, coming over to India, look, there are thinkers on the left and the right political side of the spectrum here, from the current foreign minister, Jay Shankar, to the Congress politician, Shashi Tharoor, who talk about the colonial experience in India. And there really is no way to understand modern India without at least having a recognition of the colonial lens. And so much of the pedestrian view of India is, without a doubt, mixed up in that colonial view. And sadly, unfortunately, and pathetically, even this many years since the end of British rule, a lot of it is just racist. It is, I'm sorry. And I know that that's going to be something that's going to light off a lot of comments from people, because, of course, I'm not calling anyone a racist. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that prejudicial thinking is the result of not knowing and coming to a conclusion about something without having the full picture, or at least enough information to make a wise, informed, at the very least educated guess. And I think that the reason people have so many prejudicial views towards India is because they allow the media, films, hearsay, or just borrowed cheap ideas to become the narrative for them. And that is very, very sad, because look, I think that, of course, India is different. I don't think any Indian on earth would ever dispute that. But that doesn't mean that it is a place that is any less incredible or full of wonder. Surely it has its problems. And again, I don't think any Indian would ever not admit to the problems that the country has. But to be completely one-sided, which is often the case with non-Indian views vis-a-vis the country, it's sad. And it's just straight up lame that in the 21st century, where we have access to so much information and we have greater ability to travel, that people don't debunk those unfortunately prejudicial views. So I think that's one of the reasons.
This YouTuber guy, Bold and Bankrupt, very large travel YouTuber, recently went to India, and most of the time he's positive about the countries. But for India, he was like quite negative, and that was a lot of backlash. But I think the problem is, if you just walk in the streets and you have this pedestrian view, not understanding the complexity of things, not the history, then it's kind of easy to start judging and like saying like, oh, why, what's going on, why it's working this way. So any advice for, let's say, for foreigners, how to understand that complex country as India?
Anywhere you go in the world, you have to be a sponge. You have to be willing to soak in what's there without judgment, And I think the one thing that we all spend so much time forgetting, we don't even spend any time forgetting, because we just forget it straight up, which is empathy, right? Like, what is empathy? I think that, that is one thing and one characteristic or one quality or one emotion that the world can use a lot more of right now, is empathy. No one's asking you to like everything. No one's asking you to enjoy everything. No one's asking you to even understand everything, but at least take out the time to recognize that someone else's journey isn't yours. And that person got there through a series of events and circumstances and experiences that belong to them. And those moments are their life, and they're as important to them as yours is to you. But we are so quick to judge. We are so quick to paint people with a brush that is very black or white. It's very monochrome. And the world is not monochrome. I mean, I know that here I am sitting behind all these black and white photos here at my studio of my actors, but life is gray. Life is gray. And I think that the more we embrace that incredible infinite number of shades of gray, the more empathetic we become. That's just my very, very, very humble view. And again, I'm sure the comments will light up with 1,000 thoughts on that. But ultimately, I think that if you're coming to India, you're coming to an ancient place that has existed as long as history itself, but also exists in its own right. And much like your own society, it's unapologetic about what it is. And it doesn't have to apologize or make a allowance for you. You need to recognize that you're here, and you need to be a little patient with that. And it's going to challenge you. But isn't that why you're coming? Isn't that why you travel? Isn't why you do anything to learn? If you're doing something just because it fits into your everyday and it feels comfortable, then, and that's fine. That's okay. If that's who you are, if you want to live that life, if you're happy with your everyday, then don't challenge yourself. But if you do choose to challenge yourself, be open-minded to it. India can be a dangerous, wild place, and you got to be careful, and you got to be a little bit sensitive to your whereabouts, have some street smarts. of course, especially if you're a young woman traveling on your own or a group of young women. You need to be safe. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that it's all music and candy canes, because it isn't, okay? But I'm from New York City. I mean, I wouldn't tell you to walk around certain parts of New York City in any hour of the day. You got to be smart, right? You know, I mean, you know, when I was a kid, you know, I didn't go to certain neighborhoods at a certain time of the day, not because I didn't feel like I wouldn't be welcomed, but because it wasn't safe. It wasn't safe, and that was the truth. And I mean, if you know something's not safe, you got to be a little smart about that, right? You know, you can't expect the will of the world to change to your demands. That's naive.
If you spend like 10 plus years in the US or in Europe, in most of the cases you become a citizen of the place, of the particular country. Like, how would you call yourself? You are like expat or immigrant or foreigner, or you're like pretty localized? How would you define yourself?
Expat, as far as I know, is somebody who's sent here by a company, and the company is, you know, picking up the tab on everything from the school for the kid to the house to the car, that kind of thing. Immigrant, of course, is someone who comes and sets up a life, and I'm not really sure what's in between that, but I'm sure there are many. If you're being strict about definitions, I fall under the immigrant category. I came here on my own volition, of my own will, set up a business, set up a life. The company that I run is an Indian company. Yes, of course, it now keeps me here, but it didn't send me here. Everything is kind of on my own. And it's interesting, so that word immigrant has a lot of connotation attached to it today, especially in certain parts of the world. And, you know, I live as an immigrant, and I can really empathize with the struggles that immigrants have. Now, of course, you know, I mean, I'm someone who has a university education, and I definitely come from what would be considered a middle class, even privileged background, and I fully recognize that. My journey cannot be compared to that of someone who comes from a much lesser means, and I understand their struggle is infinitely more challenging than mine. But, you know, in terms of like not having any family here, in terms of not having anybody like to call who can hook me up with like, you know, some like information really easily, or I don't know, have a cousin or a cousin who works in a certain administration to get something done. I don't have any of that. I've done it all on my own. And that's been an interesting ride because, you know, I've had the opportunity to see the Indian Administrative Services up close and personal. And, you know, it works. And I know that, you know, we always get lots of comments in our chats, you know, and they're always very, very heartwarming. So a big shout out to everybody who makes the comments. Thank you. You know, but people always think that I'm just being nice. But actually, I got to tell you, the Indian Administrative Services, you know, I've dealt with the FRROO office, which is the Foreign Registration Office, a few times. It's been pretty straightforward. It's been pretty easy stuff. As long as you show up with the papers you need to have, the signatures you need to have, you're pretty well sorted out. Actually, people are going to kind of roll their eyes at this, but the most difficult and challenging immigration situation I ever went through was in the U.S. That was really hard because, you know, my ex-wife, who was my wife at the time with my son, we had to deal with some paperwork stuff, and that was really challenging. They made that hard on us, and they made us, and they did something that I never experienced in France, because I lived there, as you know, for a long time. I never experienced here in India. In the U.S., they made me feel like a foreigner. They made us feel like, you know, we were asking for something special, like, you know, the right to be in America. And I kind of wanted to, like, remind the guys a few times, like, fellas, like, everybody in this country is kind of from somewhere, you know, like, we all have a story. So maybe, like, a little, like, take the attitude off a little bit. But there was a real kind of, like, we're America. And I was just like, okay, if that's how you feel about it. You know, and you know, of course, you find yourself like apologizing to people because you're American. You're like, I'm so sorry. There was a little chauvinism in it that was surprising to me, where in other places I haven't experienced that.
What do you feel when you are on the U.S. soil, and then when you go back to India? How do you feel?
There were things that's funny, you know, because like actually, it's very, very beautiful and incredibly gracious. But Indians, you know, because I've lived here for so long now, sometimes they'll like sort of passively just be like, oh, Jeff, you're one of us now, right? And I never really get that until actually I'm out of India and I realize how accustomed to living in India I am, how accustomed to the food and the flavors, the people, the spaces and places, the way life moves. You know, you realize how accustomed and how conditioned you become to a place when you're out of it. So, you know, and actually I do feel that when I'm in the US. I feel like, wow, I really haven't lived here in a long time and I don't really get everything about how it's done, or, you know, for instance, like one thing that I'm terrible at is Americans are pretty good at being on time. You know, if they tell you 1 o'clock, they probably mean 1 o'clock, where, you know, I'm, you know, 1:15, 1:20, But I've learned the trick with Americans is that if you message them when you're on your way, even if you're running late, you say, I'm on my way, they know you're coming. So they don't start to have some sort of like, panic attack that you're not coming. It's just, I'm coming. I'm just going to be a few minutes late, but I'm on my way. I know I have to be there. Let me reassure you. So yeah.
How's it in India? Any tricks how it works in India?
Show up. I mean, that's it. Just show up. Of course, but actually that trick of on my way is something I even use here, because traffic can be a little bonkers here in Mumbai. One always needs to sort of just kind of let people know that at least you're on the way. I think that's a polite thing to do because you can't always guarantee 100% that you're going to be on time because it's not always in your control. As a matter of fact, the monsoon is leaving us now, and it's leaving us not just in terms of the fact that the rains are stopping, thunder and lightning, but also the roads, there's a lot of potholes everywhere. So, even like, because I have a bike, we've talked about that. Like, when I'm going up and down the road, I gotta have to do some of these and some of these and some of these, some of those, and you can't always guarantee that you're going to be on time because you're not really in control of how well paved the road might be or it might not be.
Is there anything that as a Westerner, as an American, you can't do in India? Or, I don't know, some maybe social circles that you never would join being a foreigner or being an immigrant in this country?
India's social hierarchy is very complicated and can be at times very rigid for people in that hierarchy, meaning the socioeconomic hierarchy. And of course, unfortunately, we still have a caste hierarchy here in India. And it can be very, very complicated and a very delicate matter for people to deal with. But as a expat or immigrant foreigner, I don't have to deal with that because I'm out of the system. I'm not part of the hierarchy. I'm a foreign element. So people from all walks of life, from those who you would consider at sort of the elite levels down to the more, lower levels, everyone's very welcoming and very, very loving and very open-minded. So there is a sort of open invitation when it comes to the social hierarchy in that regard. But there is also a degree of, I wouldn't say it's closed off. Indians don't assume that you know anything about their culture or their country because they're so used to people being ignorant of it in a way that is diminishing and demeaning. And they're always very pleasantly surprised and extremely welcoming of those who have learned about it. So at first, people could be a little, when it comes to certain topics, be a little standoffish. But the minute they know that you have taken out the time to get to know their culture and appreciate their culture and even maybe celebrate their culture, they love that. They absolutely love that. They're extremely welcoming. So it's kind of a complicated thing because at times you're in and other times you're kind of out, and it's something you kind of have to learn how to judge. But I don't think any culture in the world is necessarily terribly different because, look, cultures are something that people will hold very dearly because they help define who they are in a very essential way.
Last time you recommended the set of films, the movies.
Oh, sure.
That people can watch to have a taste of what real Indian cinema is. Can you recommend a book, something that's maybe not so complicated, something entry-level book for people, for foreigners who want to, maybe that can spark the interest about India and explain like few things about the country?
Luckily, there is an unbelievable amount of books one can read about India, and some of them are absolutely brilliant. There are two books about Mumbai that were written relatively close to each other. One of them is called Shantaram, which actually went on to become an Apple Plus TV show, and the other one is called Maximum City. Of the two, I have to say I'm a little bit more a fan of Maximum City. I think Maximum City is a much more honest lens of Mumbai at that time in the early thousands. Gary David Roberts' Shantaram, I feel, is not great. I didn't enjoy the book at all, actually. I didn't like it even one bit. I know a lot of people love it, but I just felt it was I just didn't connect with it. Maximum City I quite like, and I felt it was very real. Mumbai, the city, has changed an enormous amount since Maximum City. Sakutu Mehta wrote that book. It's changed a huge amount since then, but nonetheless, I think that some of the things that you kind of get a flavor for in the book are still kind of true here. So that's a book I would say check out, Maximum City. It's a great book. But the first book I ever read about India was Gandhi's book, My Experiments with Truth. And again, it's really interesting because that book feels very antiquated, or it doesn't really apply to certainly modern metropolitan tier 1, fast-moving, expensive India. But, you know, at the same time, there's an India in the village, right? There are the village Indians, and there are agricultural Indians, and so many of the people in this country still live that way, the vast majority actually. And those values and ideals are actually not that antiquated. They still sort of do exist on that level. Certainly things have evolved, no doubt, that goes without saying. A lot of the things that was set up in the Gandhian philosophy still kind of remain true in other parts of the country. And that's, of course, a very divisive statement, because a lot of people, you know, Gandhi's legacy is something that's debated a great deal, and his economic and political thinking is something that a lot of people have a lot of opinions about. I would just say that, you know, I think that it depends on what lens you want to see the country through.
You do a lot of like directing, acting, and like you actually teach people how to do acting, yeah? And like professionals and non-professionals. Is the thing as Indian acting exists, or acting is pretty universal?
There is no such thing as Indian acting or Russian acting or American acting. Acting is acting. And I guess the way I teach acting, or the way we approach acting with the method that we use here, you know, which we lovingly call the Goldberg method, is, first of all, it has to be practical. It has to be something that you can apply. You have to be able to use it. You know, rolling around on the floor in an acting class is great if you have an emotional breakthrough, but if you can't take that emotional breakthrough and bring it to your character, bring it to the stage, bring it to the picture, then whilst it may be very satisfying for you, how is it effective in the world of your career and your craft? And that's the second thing after practical, is craft. It's all about knowing how to do it. It's all about knowing how to apply the science of acting and the tools that you've learned to the craft so that you can be successful in front of the camera or up on a stage. And finally, the reason I think acting is because this is the thing, is that the emotional language of how people behave and react is something they learn long before they walk into a classroom. You know how to love, you know how to cry, you know how to feel joy and hurt and pain and anger and envy and disgust. You know how to do that. I can't teach you how to feel those things. You should know how to feel those things already. And if you're going to manifest them between action and cut, i.e. during the scene, my job is to help you access the practical tools to enable you to do that in a truthful, honest manner. What that looks like will culturally, inevitably be individual to you. So if you're Indian, then those cultural facets of yourself will emerge naturally. I don't have to accentuate them. And I think that that's a question that often is kind of a roadblock to understanding the craft of acting, because the craft of acting is about expressing the human experience in a very honest, truthful way. Living as an actor is a much more apt way to put it, according to me, than performing as an actor. And of course, there are other people who would disagree with that, and I would love to discuss that. But for me, the performances that speak to me and the actors who really resonate with me are the ones who I can see are actually experiencing the trajectory of the character, the arc of the film, and the moment of the scene in a very honest, believable way. Because that resonates very deeply inside of me. It makes me believe them, it makes me relate to them, it makes me emotionally connect to them.
For those who want to learn acting, we will leave a link for Goldberg Studio in the description, so feel free to reach out. What's the biggest lesson that you learned in India? Or let's put it this way, India taught you?
Patience. I am not by nature a really patient person. It's not a characteristic that I was naturally displaying throughout my life, let's put it that way. But India has taught me to be patient. It is not, and I don't mean that I'm waiting in the road or stuck in traffic. What I mean is that life has a different rhythm. And we kind of jokingly spoke about IST, Indian Suggested Time, once before. Yeah, India has taught me to be patient, and has taught me, especially about my career as a filmmaker, to really kind of take my time, to recognize the importance of taking my time and the value of taking my time. And that's been a very, very, very humbling lesson, which is actually the second characteristic or thing that the country has taught me, is humility. In the West, we spend so much time obsessed with the idea of ourself, and we spend so much time trying to nurture our individuality and our ego. And that does not necessarily mean that it doesn't exist in the East or certainly in India. But there is a stream of thought and there is a stream of consciousness and a very real narrative about how individualism can be deeply destructive and how your ego can be something that consumes you to the point of self-destruction. And as a filmmaker, as a writer, actor in that sphere, you spend a lot of time swimming in waters that are not humble, and you are around people who are not humble. And I'm very grateful to the fact that for whatever reason, albeit the philosophy, the religious texts, the people, the travel I've had, the interactions I've had, I've learned to be a lot more humble and recognize that I'm part of a much bigger thing, and that is a beautiful, very satisfying feeling for me. So I'd say humility and patience.
स्टार्टिंग में उन्होंने बात बिल्कुल सही की है कि जब हम सोशल मीडिया उठाकर देखते हैं तो हमारे साउथ एशिया का जो रीजन है, जो इंडियन सब कॉन्टिनेंट है, यहाँ पर जो है ना, जो लोग विजिट करके जा चुके हैं उनके व्यूज़ तो बहुत ज़्यादा डिफरेंट और बहुत ज़्यादा अच्छे जो है वो आपको दिखाई देते हैं कि भाई बहुत ज़्यादा जो है मेहमान नवाज लोग हैं यहाँ के। अगर आप जाते हैं तो आपको बहुत अच्छे तरीके से जो है वो ट्रीट करते हैं। लेकिन ऑन दी अदर साइड जो है मैं बहुत सारे ऐसे जो है वो क्लिप्स भी देखे हुए हैं जिन लोगों ने कभी विजिट नहीं किया था, उन्होंने सिर्फ जो है ना इंटरनेट पे कहीं पे कोई एक आधा क्लिप जो है वो देख लिया होता, अगर वो ये उनका ना एक वो माइंड सेट बन जाता है कि भाई दुनिया के सबसे अगर आपको जो है ना एक बुरा एरिया कहा जाए तो वो आपको जो है ना यहाँ पर शायद जो है वो देखने को मिलता है, जो कि रियलिटी के बिल्कुल बरअक्स जो है वो चीज़ें आपको नज़र आती हैं।
अच्छा, वैसे आज की वीडियो देखकर और मतलब जो गेस्ट थे उनकी बातें सुनकर एक चीज़ जो मेरे माइंड में आई ना हमारे लोगों को लेकर, कि हम लोग पाकिस्तान की अगर मैं बात करूँ तो हमारे सारे लोग वैसे बहुत ज़्यादा प्रभावित हैं। और इवन कि मैं अगर सोच का नज़रिया भी देखूं, ये जैसे उन्होंने बीच में बात की सेल्फ ऑब्सेशन की बात की, ठीक है, इगोइस्टिक होने की बात की, ये सारी चीज़ें यहाँ पर काफ़ी भारी मात्रा में पाया जाता है। यानी कि मैं वेस्ट की बात करूँगी, वो तो फिर काम करते हैं एक डेवलप्ड कंट्रीज़ की आप कह लो कि लिस्ट में है, लेकिन पाकिस्तान में तो ऐसी कोई चीज़ नहीं है। बट लोगों में मुझे ये चीज़ें जो हैं वो नज़र आती हैं। इनफैक्ट मैं ये बात बोलूँगी कि अगर हम लोग इनिशियली बात करें तो, क्योंकि मैं हमेशा ये बात करती हूँ कि हम लोग कुएं के मेंढक हैं, हम लोगों को इतना ज़्यादा बाहर की दुनिया का नहीं पता था, बट हम जजमेंटल बहुत ज़्यादा है। सो कहीं पर भी जाने के लिए आपको, मुझे ये लगता है कि वाकई में इतना न्यूट्रल होकर जाना चाहिए, क्योंकि बहुत मरतबा ऐसी चीज़ें होती हैं जो हमारे मिजाज के मुताबिक नहीं होती, स्पेशली ट्रैवलिंग के दौरान। और अगर मुझे लगता है कि आपको एक्सपीरियंसेस नहीं लेने तो आपको कभी भी ट्रैवल नहीं करना चाहिए, क्योंकि मैंने भी अपनी पर्सनल जर्नी जो थोड़ी बहुत मैंने लाइफ में की है, जो मेरी रही है, मैंने यही चीज़ एक्सपीरियंस की है कि हर चीज़ आपके मुताबिक नहीं होती। इनफैक्ट बहुत सारी चीज़ें होती हैं जो आपके मिजाज के, आपकी सोच के अगेंस्ट जा रही होती है। आपने किस तरीके से उसमें एडजस्ट होना, ये अब आप पर डिपेंड करता है, क्योंकि वो वहाँ का कल्चर है, वो वहाँ के लोग हैं। आप बाहर से उठकर आएँ, अब ज़रूरी नहीं जैसा आपका घर पे एक माहौल है वैसा ही आपको बाहर मिलेगा, बट येस लोग बहुत ज़्यादा जजमेंटल हो जाते हैं। और उसका एक रीज़न मुझे नज़र आता है, एक तो आप वाकई में मतलब कह लो कि बहुत ही अच्छे माइंडसेट के साथ आप कह लो कि बात करते हो, एक न्यूट्रल होकर के हाँ कुछ अच्छाइयाँ भी हैं, कुछ बुराइयाँ भी हैं जो कि हर जगह पर होती हैं। बट एक चीज़ ये होती है कि लोगों का नज़रिया कि आपकी नज़र जानी कहाँ पर है। एंड मोस्ट ऑफ द टाइम मैंने ये चीज़ देखी है मीडिया की, लोगों की, कि उन्होंने हमेशा दूसरे कंट्री की वो चीज़ हाईलाइट करनी है कि जहाँ पर जो नज़र है ना वो बुरी साइड पर जाए और उसको पूरी दुनिया में पोर्ट्रे किया जाए। इवन कि अगर हम लोग वेस्ट की बात करें तो वेस्ट, जब तक मैं कहूँगी कि सोशल मीडिया नहीं आया था, लोगों की एक्सेस में इतना नहीं था, तो हम सबको यही लगता था कि वेस्ट में तो कभी कोई गरीब होता ही नहीं है, वहाँ पर तो लोग बहुत अच्छे घरों में रहते हैं। और जब अमेरिका का मतलब उसकी स्लम देखी, वहाँ पर ऐसे एरियाज देखे, मतलब बहुत सारे ब्लॉगर्स ने वीडियोस देखी, न्यूयॉर्क की रोड्स के अलावा जैसे गंद पड़ा होता है, यानी कि हमारे यहाँ पर हम लोग भी देखते हैं कि ठीक है सड़कों पर ऐसे गंद पड़ा होता है, हम कहते हैं कि हाय हमारी ज़िंदगी ऐसी है। लेकिन वहाँ पर भी ये सब चीज़ें वो पोर्ट्रे नहीं करते उन चीज़ों को। तो मुझे लगता है कि आपका एक आपके अंदर एक चीज़ होती है कि आपने अपने आप को कितना सुपीरियर दिखाना है, और ये चीज़ आपको वेस्ट में नज़र आती है।
यार देखें, मीडिया का एक्सेस जो है ना, वो यहाँ पर मैं बात करूँगा कि भाई जो वेस्टर्न मीडिया है ना, उसे पूरी दुनिया में बहुत ज़्यादा एक्सेस जो है वो आपको नज़र आती है। ऑन द अदर साइड जो है ना, हम अपने लोकल मीडिया की बात करें तो हमारा लोकल मीडिया भी अपने मुल्क में इतना ज़्यादा कंट्रोल्ड है कि भाई वो यहाँ की भी चीज़ें उस तरह नहीं दिखा पाता। दूसरे कंट्रीज़ का जो हाईलाइट दिखानी होती है, जो उन्हें बताया जाता है, सिर्फ जो है वही चीज़ें जो है वो दिखाई जाती हैं, खुलकर कुछ भी जो है वो नहीं बताया जाता। तो मेरा ख्याल है ये एक बहुत बड़ा फैक्टर है कि आपने दूसरे कंट्रीज के जो मीडिया है उन्हें काफ़ी ज़्यादा ओपन हैंड जो हैं वो दिए हुए हैं।
लेकिन उसके साथ साथ अभी देखो, जो से उन्होंने खुद भी बात की है, देखो हम अपने यहाँ के मीडिया की बात करें, यस मैं अग्री करूंगी, लेकिन आप हर जगह के मीडिया के बारे में ये स्टेटमेंट नहीं दे सकते, क्योंकि अगर हम लोग इंडिया के बारे में बात करें तो जैसे उन्होंने बोला भी कि मतलब यहाँ पर जो फिल्म इंडस्ट्री है या जो मीडिया है वो मतलब काफ़ी ओपन है कि लाइक वो हर चीज़ दिखाता है। सो मुझे लगता है कि वेस्ट में बल्कि मुझे ये पॉलिसी नज़र आती है कि वो लोग शायद अपनी चीज़ें इतना ज़्यादा हाईलाइट नहीं करते, वो दूसरे बाकी दुनिया की जो न्यूज़ है ना वो दिखाते हैं।
मीडिया की जो एक्सेस है ना, उसकी मैं बेसिकली मैं इस टाइम में बात करता था। जैसे अभी हम फॉर एग्जांपल बीबीसी की बात करते हैं, ठीक है ना, बीबीसी आपको डिफरेंट लैंग्वेजेस में जो है ना वो चीज़ों को कवर करते हुए जो वो नजर आता है। इवन के रीजनल लैंग्वेजेस को भी वो कवर करते हैं। ऑन दी अदर साइड जैसे इंडियन मीडिया की हम बात करते हैं तो इंडियन मीडिया आपको मेन दो चीज़ों में नजर आता है, या तो इंग्लिश में होगा या हिंदी में होगा या अपनी रीजनल लैंग्वेज में होगा। और मूवीज़ की भी अगर बात करें, जो मूवीज़ के माध्यम से जो है वो चीज़ें जो है वो देखने को मिलती हैं। अब आकर जो है पैन इंडियन मूवीज़ जो है वो बनना शुरू हुई हैं, और कुछ मूवीज़ ऐसी हैं जो डिफरेंट लैंग्वेजेस में जो है ट्रांसलेट की जाती हैं।
रीच की बात नहीं कर रही मैं, यहाँ पर बात कर रही हूँ कि आप कितने ओपन हो अपनी बातों को मतलब डिस्कस करने के लिए। सो मैं और अपने मुद्दों को डिस्कस करने के लिए, अपनी प्रॉब्लम्स को डिस्कस करने के लिए मैं उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में बात कर रही हूँ। बाकी जो उन्होंने बात वैसे बीच में एक ट्रिक यूज़ किया, वो ट्रिक वैसे मैं यूज़ करती हूँ, मैं बहुत बुरी हूँ इस मामले में, क्योंकि मेरी वैसे एक ही फ्रेंड है और जब भी मैंने उसको मिलने जाना होता है वो टाइम पर पहुंची होती है, और मैं हमेशा ये बात बोल रही हूँ, हालांकि मैं समटाइम्स ऐसा होता है मैं घर पे होती हूँ
भाई हमारा जो है ना पाकिस्तान में 5 मिनट मतलब आधा घंटा सब्र करो। अगर आप कह रहे हो 5 मिनट में मैं पहुंच जाऊंगा, इट्स मीन कि आपको 15 मिनट से 30 मिनट लग जाएंगे।
लेकिन और इसके साथ मुझे एक बात बड़ी खूबसूरत लगी, जैसे उन्होंने बोला कि आपको एक स्पॉन्ज की तरह होना चाहिए, मतलब आप कहीं पर भी जाओ आप मतलब उसमें एक तरह से मतलब एब्जॉर्ब हो जाओ, मिक्सअप हो जाओ। और ये चीज़ मुझे लगता है कि अगर हम लोग देखते हैं कि आज के टाइम में इंडिया में बहुत ज़्यादा फॉरेनर्स हैं, तो उसका रीज़न भी यही है कि वो हर बाहर से आने वाले लोगों को अपने अंदर मिक्सअप कर लेते हैं। और मैं ये बात बोलूँगी, और वो वहाँ पर काफ़ी ज़्यादा इनफेक्ट आप देखोगे इतने सालों से लोग, जितने भी हम लोगों ने एक्सपेट्स को देखा है, वो बहुत ज़्यादा
टाइम से रह रहे हैं।
हाँ, टाइम से रह रहे हैं और ऑब्वियसली कंफर्टेबल हैं तो वो वहाँ पर रह रहे हैं। और जहाँ पर बात की उन्होंने लाइक जो चीज़ें सही मतलब एक जगह पर जब आप रहते हो तो कुछ चीज़ें आपको अच्छी भी नज़र आती हैं, कुछ चीज़ें आपको नहीं भी अच्छी नज़र आती, लेकिन उनके लिए लोग जो है वो हमेशा वेलकमिंग रहे हैं। जैसे उन्होंने कास्ट सिस्टम को लेकर बात की, और तो मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि जैसे मतलब इंडिया में हमें कास्ट सिस्टम के बारे में मतलब वीडियोज़ में कहीं ना कहीं पर सुनने को मिलता है। पाकिस्तान में मुझे अगर मैं देखूँ तो मुझे सेक्ट जो है डिफरेंट सेक्ट्स, उनका एक प्रॉब्लम जो है वो नजर आता है। ब्रादरी सिस्टम, हाँ यस, उनका भी जो है मतलब अगर इंटीरियर में चले जाओ तो आपको ब्रादरी सिस्टम जो है वो बड़ा नजर आएगा। सेक्ट का बहुत ज़्यादा इशू है पाकिस्तान में कि डिफरेंट सेक्ट के लोग जो हैं वो ही एक दूसरे को जो है वो अच्छा नहीं समझते। बाकी लेकिन बड़े बड़े शहरों में आपको फिर भी थोड़ा जो है मुझे लगता है कि यस, और एंड आई एम श्योर कि इंडिया में भी अगर आपको ये चीज़ कहीं पर नज़र आती होगी तो मुझे लगता है कि शायद इंटीरियर में ही नज़र आती होगी, क्योंकि बड़े बड़े शहरों में तो अगर देखो तो मुझे लगता है कि वहाँ पर लाइफ इतनी फास्ट है, मतलब इंडिया की अगर हम लोग शहरों की बात करें तो कि मुझे नहीं लगता कि वहाँ पर लोग जो और पढ़ लिख गए हैं इतना ज़्यादा कि वो इन चीज़ों में पढ़ते भी होंगे। कमेंट सेक्शन में बाकी आप ज़रूर बताइएगा कि आपको क्या लगता है कि जो फॉरेनर्स हैं वो यहाँ पर आकर क्यों इतना ज़्यादा अच्छे से एडजस्ट हो जाते हैं इंडिया में। ज़रूर हमें बताइएगा कमेंट सेक्शन में, और इसी के साथ हमें ज़्यादा
लाइक, सब्सक्राइब, शेयर, गुड बाय।